Alrighty, good afternoon to everybody out there. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is CJ Curry. If this is your first time here, definitely hit the subscribe button. Make sure that the notification bell is turned on so that you don't miss any of these live streams going forward. We go live every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern time, talking some fantasy point props on my favorite site of all time, Prize Picks. If you don't play on Prize Picks yet, now's a great time to do so. 100% instant deposit match. That means for every dollar you put in, up to $100, they're going to match that payout for you. All you do, go down to the description of this video. There's a link to sign up for Prize Picks today. Download the app and get going. All right. Now, if this is your first time ever checking out a Prize Picks video, Prize Picks is pretty cool. You just pick your favorite player, your favorite fantasy point prop. You can choose over or under. You parlay them together with 2, 3, 4, or 5 picks. And then you choose how much you want to enter in. And you can win anywhere from 2 times up to 10 times your money. All right. And that's the name of the game, Prize Picks. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into today's 10-game NBA slate. There's lots of news, lots of things still pending, but we're going to do our best to kind of work around all of this pending news here and see if we can land on some winning picks. Appreciate everybody joining me in the chat. I see I've got George up in here. Shout out to you, George. Alexander's in the building. Marcus, liking some Bam Adebayo points. Appreciate you being here. Everyday Fantasy, good to have you up in the building as well. Jeff B, 1988 says, I didn't know you did an afternoon show. Well, listen, I don't always do an afternoon show. This is kind of a newer thing. The folks at Fantasy Labs reached out to me. They said, hey, we like what you're doing on your channel. Come over to our channel and see if you could do something similar. So we're doing something similar here, but a little different. So the twist on this is we're going to stick to fantasy point props. We're going to look at who the best overs and unders are in terms of fantasy points. We're over on my channel. You can catch me at CJ Curry over on YouTube. We do prize picks videos over there, but we stick to single stat player props. So things like points, rebounds, assists, points, rebounds, and assists, 3-point makes, free throw makes, and blocks and steals. So this show will be mostly focused on fantasy points. So we'll do things a little bit differently here. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. Like I said, 10-game NBA slate. Starting things off here at the top, 7 p.m., we've got the Milwaukee Bucks at the Cleveland Cavaliers. Right now, the implied total for these two teams, 111 for the Bucks, with the Cavaliers at 106.75. So just a 3.5-point spread here. Should be plenty of points up on the board. Should be a pretty fun game. The next game up on the list here, Charlotte Hornets at the Indiana Pacers. 116 implied point total for the Hornets, 113.5 for the Pacers. Going down to the next game here, the Los Angeles Clippers at my favorite team, the Orlando Magic. 106.25 is the total for the Clippers, 108.25 for the Orlando Magic. Going down to the next one here, 7:30 p.m. New York Knicks at the Miami Heat. 98.75 implied point total for the Knicks. Not very high there. And then the Miami Heat at 104.25. I expect this game to be kind of a slower paced, grind it out type of game. 7:30 p.m. brings us the Sacramento Kings, who got absolutely mollywopped last night by the Boston Celtics. Not a good game for the Sacramento Kings, but they're on a second half of a back-to-back against the Atlanta Hawks tonight. This game, an 8-point spread at the moment. So things could get out of hand. Might just be a first half only play for me. First half only, because it looks like it's teetering on the line of potential blowout here. Then we got the Denver Nuggets at the Brooklyn Nets. My man Nikola Jokic had a monster game last night against the Detroit Pistons. It's already been ruled out that Nick Claxton will be out for the Brooklyn Nets. So who's going to stop Nikola Jokic tonight on Brooklyn? I'm sure he's going to be a name that's going to come up when we start doing some of this player prop research. But 8-point spread on this game might be a first half only play, just in case things get out of hand and Brooklyn ends up getting blown out. No KD, no Kyrie for Brooklyn. So it'll be the James Harden show once again. 8 p.m. also brings us the Toronto Raptors at the Chicago Bulls. 4.5-point spread on this game. Not a ton of points between these two teams, which is why at 107.5 for the Raptors, you kind of see they show up at this light pink color. That means they're not going to score a whole lot of points here. Not a lot of points. All right. And then for the Memphis Grizzlies, San Antonio Spurs game, that one gets started at 8:30 p.m. This one's going to be fun. We're going to have Ja Morant versus DeJounte Murray, two of the best young point guards in the league. I'm excited to see this head-to-head matchup between these two young point guards. Just a 3-point spread and plenty of points on both sides of this one. Then we move it into the 10 o'clock slate here. We've got the Dallas Mavericks at the Portland Trail Blazers. Mavs 110.5, Portland 106.5. Just a 4-point spread, surprisingly. I thought that the Mavericks would be bigger favorites to win, but they are on the road, so things typically a little more difficult. And then finally, the late night hammer, the last game of the night, the Phoenix Suns at the Utah Jazz. 112.75 on the board for Phoenix. And then for Utah, 111.25 points. And then you got a 4-point spread. So that game hopefully stays close and competitive. We saw a pretty good game for young Cam Johnson the last time these two teams took the floor. By the way, this is like a rematch. These teams just played each other one game ago. Now they're facing each other again tonight. So Devin Booker ended up having a very good game. Chris Paul had a really good game as well. Cam Johnson, who I mentioned before, had a very solid game. But Utah's going to have a couple of guys back tonight. Sounds like Bogdanovich will be in there on a minutes limit, but he'll be back. And then Mike Conley Jr., who was not in the lineup last game, he'll also be in for Utah tonight. So while we're talking about some of this player news, let's go ahead and switch things over to the next tab here and see who's going to be in, who's going to be out, what's some of the player news for us to be on the lookout for. Again, appreciate everybody joining me. Wesley, good to see you this afternoon, my friend. If you guys are down for some fantasy point props, let me know in the chat section. Who is it that you're liking? Is there anybody that's standing out to you in your early research throughout the day? Let me know, and I'll definitely help you guys in terms of researching those player props, and we'll take a look at them together. All right, so scrolling through some of this news real quick, we got Mo Bamba for the Orlando Magic. He is available to play Wednesday, so sounds like Mo Bamba will be good to go. We got Mitchell Robinson of the New York Knicks. He expects to play Wednesday today, which is today. He expects to play for New York tonight as well. Jared Allen remains questionable for the Cleveland Cavaliers. If he's out, then you might see a bump up to somebody like Mitchell Robinson or Julius Randle on the other side. Might be an easier matchup, don't you think? Gordon Hayward, he is going to be questionable for today. He did miss last night's game, and maybe Gordon Hayward does not get it going tonight. Tyler Herro, conditioning, he's going to be available to play as well, so we should get Tyler Herro back for the Miami Heat. We got Will Barton, who missed yesterday with a hamstring injury. He's going to be questionable. JaMychal Green, he's going to play Wednesday. Nick Claxton, like I mentioned, already ruled out. Paul Millsap ruled out as well. So it might be a Dayshawn Sharp. Is that his name? Dayshawn Sharp? Am I getting that right? Might be a Dayshawn Sharp type of game tonight. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other news here. Fred VanVleet, Scotty Barnes, both questionable for the Toronto Raptors. We got Marcus Morris already ruled out. He did not play in the last game. Clippers nearly got blown out. Somehow they turned the tables on the Washington Wizards and ended up coming back from like a 30-point deficit and beating the Wizards unbelievably. With the other news here, Nick Batum is going to play Wednesday for the Los Angeles Clippers. We got De'Aaron Fox, who is questionable. He did not play in the last game. Like I mentioned, Sacramento ended up getting stomped by the Boston Celtics, so they're definitely going to need some De'Aaron Fox tonight. Looks like Terrence Davis is out for Sacramento. Metu is questionable to play for Sacramento. And then some of this other news pertains to Thursday. Sterling Brown for the Dallas Mavericks. He is going to be out, as well as Tim Hardaway Jr. He'll be out as well. So there you go. There's your point totals, your spreads. Let's go ahead and get into some of these player props. So we're going to be obviously using the Fantasy Labs projections and models here to help kind of guide our way through tonight's slate. So let's start things off. This is a totally free tool. This is by a different site, Fantasy Pros. It's totally free for you to check out. So we're going to go through like position by position. We'll be looking at this last column here, which stands for FD points, fantasy points, FanDuel points. And we're going to see if any of these teams are standing out. Now, the first one that catches my eye is the Brooklyn Nets, who are giving up over 57 fantasy points per game to the point guard position. So what does that mean? Well, that means that somebody like Monty Morris could be in play. Monty Morris typically getting a lot of those point guard minutes for the Denver Nuggets, going up against a Brooklyn Nets team that's giving up the second most fantasy points per game to the point guard position. That's over the last 7 games. So Monty Morris, not a sexy name, not a household name, but we got to talk about him. We got to talk about him because the matchup looks right here. So over the last 5 games, he's went over 22 fantasy points. By the way, Prize Picks in terms of their fantasy point scoring, exactly the same as FanDuel. So if you go to the Fantasy Labs models like I'm doing, you can use the FanDuel projections there. It's a 1-to-1 exact comparison to what Prize Picks does here with their fantasy point props. Okay? So Monty Morris, over the last 5 games, he has gone over 22 fantasy points in 3 out of 5 games. And then tonight, he gets this juicy matchup, as I mentioned, against the Brooklyn Nets, who are giving up the second most fantasy points per game. But we mentioned at the top of the show, maybe this game gets a little out of hand. Maybe this game becomes a blowout situation for the Denver Nuggets over the Brooklyn Nets. So let's just pull a full game projection up here for Monty Morris. I got him projected for 25.5 fantasy points, and he's got a ceiling of 38.8. So there's some upside here in this matchup for Monty Morris to go for 38 or more fantasy points against this Brooklyn Nets team. He's projected to get about 30 minutes of run tonight, and the rating in terms of a fantasy play tonight, 75.7. Not bad. That's out of 100, 100 being the best. So he's rated pretty well in this particular matchup here. Now, one thing that you can do using a site like StatMuse, which is pretty cool, is you can actually look at Monty Morris first half FanDuel points versus, well, we'll just do logs. We'll just take a look at his game logs here. And then we'll go over here, just in case we're worried about this game blowing out. We'll go to NBA 1H and just look at the first half fantasy scores for Monty Morris. So we'll scroll through here, or you could use the search function at the top of the page. But Monty Morris is at 11 fantasy points. 11 fantasy points. So let's just take a look at the last 5 games from Morris here. First half only fantasy points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games. 5 games in a row, he has covered 11 fantasy points. So that's pretty good. That's a 100% hit rate. Now we mix into the fact that he's facing a team who's giving up the second most fantasy points per game to opposing point guards. And I think we've got ourselves a pretty decent pick here. Now we go back to the 5 previous games from Morris. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see that he's covered 11 fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games in the first half. So overall, looking at the last 10 games, we've got Monty Morris as a 90% hit rate. 9 out of the last 10 games, he's covered 11 fantasy points. Chat, what are you guys liking about this? Are you liking the over here on Monty Morris at 11 fantasy points in this matchup against the Brooklyn Nets? He's projected to go over his full game fantasy score by about 3 fantasy points. He's gone over 11 first half fantasy points in 9 out of his last 10 games, according to StatMuse. And the matchup looks like a prime matchup. Are you in or you out here on Monty Morris at 11 fantasy points? Let me know. All right, so that's the first one, and I think that's a very good one for us to target tonight. What else is standing out here? We go through this list real quick. Denver Nuggets giving up 55.5 fantasy points per game. So we like some Monty Morris at 11 fantasy points, first half only. What about this guy, James Harden? No Kevin Durant, no Kyrie Irving. So what does that mean for James Harden? I think this means that he's going to have a tremendous amount of usage and plenty of opportunities to rack up the fantasy points. So let's take a look at this matchup for James Harden. We know that the Denver Nuggets giving up the 4th most fantasy points per game over the last 7 games to point guards. James Harden is the de facto point guard for the Brooklyn Nets. The ball is going to be in his hands a ton tonight, right? Let's go take a look at James Harden's full game fantasy points projection. So we'll switch back over to the NBA, go to fantasy score, and we could just type in Harden's name. And we've got James Harden at 52.5 fantasy points. You can see in the last 5 games, he's gone over in 2 out of 5. That's a 40% hit rate. I think tonight he'll be in a great spot here. A great spot to eclipse 52.5 fantasy points. The Lakers was his opponent last night. He's on a back-to-back here. He put up almost 67 fantasy points against the Los Angeles Lakers. Now, if we go find the Lakers here and see how many fantasy points they're giving up to opposing point guards over the last 7, you can see they're giving up about 53.1. 53.1. Well, this matchup against the Nuggets is even better. Even better tonight. So I think James Harden's definitely going to be in play. But again, if you're worried about this game potentially blowing out, I totally understand. But the great thing about Prize Picks is that you can take a first half only play in a blowout situation. It might be a little bit safer that way. Nonetheless, I've got James Harden projected for about 51.3 fantasy points. His rating, 87.7 out of a possible 100. So a very, very strong rating on James Harden. It looks like the Fantasy Labs models really, really liking some James Harden tonight. So we'll do what we did for Monty Morris because we're a little worried. We're a little gun shy about clicking the over on a full game prop. We're going to go ahead and pull James Harden up here. First half only, 26.5 fantasy points. Now we're going to go back to StatMuse, and we're going to take a look at James Harden here. James Harden, first half FanDuel points logs. Let's see how he's done with 26.5 fantasy score. Well, the last game, which was against the Los Angeles Lakers, no KD, no Kyrie Irving. That was last night. 39.9 first half fantasy points. Pretty darn good, right? Then we go back and look. He did fall short against Minnesota, had 32.7. So he goes over there. 28.5 goes over there, and 26.6. And those were games with Kyrie Irving. So over his last 5 games, he has covered 26.5 fantasy points in 4 out of 5 games. That's an 80% hit rate. We go back to the previous 5 games. Over, falls short here, goes over there, falls short there. So he was 3 for 5 in that stretch. So overall, 7 out of 10, 70% hit rate. Let's take a look when we add in the no Kyrie or no Kevin Durant factor, what happens here. So James Harden, first half FanDuel points, and then we'll add in without Kyrie Irving. 39.9, 37.5, 32.6, 29.3. I think you guys kind of get the picture here. this looks like a pretty strong play. I'm going to probably say that James Harden over 26.5 fantasy score looks like a pretty good way to go. In fact, one thing that you can do here, is build a little same game parlay action. We could go over on Monty Morris, go over on James Harden. Maybe we throw $20 on it. I'm going to power play it, meaning when I lock this in, if both picks hit, I'll get 3 times my entry. Let's fire it up. Boom. 1 entry in the books. There you have it. All right. Let's take a look and see what else is standing out to us tonight. Just looking at the point guard position. We got the Indiana Pacers facing the Charlotte Hornets. Indiana's given up nearly 53 fantasy points per game to opposing point guards. So that would put somebody like Lamelo Ball or Terry Rozier clearly in play. Let's take a look at Lamelo Ball's game logs here. 37.5 fantasy points over his last 5 games. He's covered this in 2 out of 5. So 40% hit rate at covering. 37.5. Decent, but I have a feeling Terry Rozier is going to be a little bit better. Yeah, a little bit better. 36 fantasy points out of the last 5 games. He's covered in 3 out of 5. So let's take a look at the shooting guard spot here against Indiana and see how many fantasy points per game the Pacers are giving up to opposing shooting guards. 39.4. So between point guards and shooting guards, they're giving up quite a few fantasy points. Now, Rozier has gone under in his last 2 games, but maybe this is finally a bounce back or a get right spot for Rozier against this Pacers squad. Let's take a look at both projections for LaMelo Ball and Terry Rozier. Again, we're going to be using the Fantasy Labs FanDuel projections. So we'll type in LaMelo Ball's name. I've got him projected for 43.3 fantasy points, guys. 43.3. That's nearly 6 fantasy points higher than where he's at on the board at 37.5. Now, Terry Rozier, also in a good spot. 35.1 fantasy points. All right, so out of the 2, it looks like the Fantasy Labs models is favoring this matchup a little bit more for LaMelo Ball. And if you want to take things a step further, you can using StatMuse. Love StatMuse, by the way. Love. LaMelo Ball FanDuel points logs. You can kind of get a bigger picture here of how many times he's covered 37.5 points over the last 5 and 10 games. So he's 2-4 out of his last 5. 2 out of his last 5. Not great, but not terrible. And then we go back a little bit further and look at the previous 5. 2 out of 5 there. So overall, just a 40% hit rate in the last 10. So maybe there's a little bit of risk here. Now we could take this in a step further here versus Pacers logs. See what we've got. Okay. Things are looking a little bit better here. Listen, the Hornets played the Pacers back on December 29th of this season last year. LaMelo Ball, 47.9 FanDuel points against them. Now back on November 19th, this season, last year, 55.2 fantasy points. And back on October 20th, Charlotte versus Indiana, 56.3 fantasy points. So he's crushed 37.5 fantasy points in 3 straight games this season against the Indiana Pacers. He's gone over in all 3 by a lot. So maybe LaMelo Ball is the better play over Terry Rozier. All right. Let's see what else we've got as we work our way through this board here. Looking at some of the other maybe good spots here for shooting guards. We got the Sacramento Kings. Sacramento, who are they playing again? Let me take a look here. They don't have any of them up on the board. I think we're waiting on some De'Aaron Fox news. Yeah. So that's unfortunate. We won't be able to take advantage of that. Let's just take a look at some of the Kings. Maybe they've got some projections up already. They do. They got De'Aaron Fox at Atlanta at 36.6 fantasy points. But again, I don't think we're going to get any of those guys up on the board, any of the Sacramento guys on the board until De'Aaron Fox, his status is confirmed. So going up against Sacramento, though, is the Atlanta Hawks. So let's look at that. They're giving up over 43 fantasy points per game to shooting guards. So maybe somebody like, maybe you go with Trae Young here. Sacramento against point guards, a little bit more of a difficult matchup for somebody like Trae, giving up 40.1 fantasy points, 3rd fewest. So I wish we had, like, I don't know, Kevin Huerter or somebody like that, or Bogdanovich available for the Atlanta Hawks. But let's take a look at Trae Young real quick while we're talking about him. I've got Young projected for 48.2 fantasy points, which puts him over 46 by quite a bit. If we open up his game logs here, you can kind of see it's been hit or miss for Trae Young in covering this fantasy points prop. He's only gone over twice out of his last 5 games. So I'm going to have to wait and see on the De'Aaron Fox news, see who's in or who's out. That game could end up being a blowout, though. What else do we have here? We got the Utah Jazz giving up over 43 fantasy points per game to opposing shooting guards. We talked about Devin Booker, who had a very strong game the last time these two teams met. Booker's up at 41.5 fantasy points today. He's at 54.9 the last time he faced Utah, which was just 2 days ago, January 24th. 54.9 fantasy points. So you can kind of see what type of upside Devin Booker has without DeAndre Ayton and Jay Crowder in the lineup. Devin Booker really balls out. So let's take a look at the projection here for Devin Booker. Maybe he's in play tonight against Utah. No Donovan Mitchell for the Utah Jazz. So it'll be interesting to see how Devin Booker fares against Jordan Clarkson. Is that who's going to be in there? Joe Ingles? Who's going to be guarding this guy? Maybe they're going to put Royce O'Neal on him. I don't know. I'm not really scared of any of those guys, right? But anyway, projected for 41.6 fantasy points. He's got a ceiling of 57.6. And his rating is over 85. So I think Devin Booker could be in a potentially good spot against this Utah Jazz team in sort of a back-to-back, a rematch type of game. What are you guys thinking about Devin Booker? You in or you out? What's up to Wesley? Yo, boss man, what's happening? Gordan fantasy points. Which Gordan are you talking about? Is that Aaron Gordon or Eric Gordon? Or is it some other Gordon? Maybe it's Gordon Hayward. I don't think he's going to play tonight. You got to let me know a little bit more what you're talking about there. Everyday fantasy. Danger the safety dog says Cole Anthony over fantasy points and Mason Plumlee over fantasy points. Little fun fact about Mason Plumlee. I played the over on his rebounds last night at 6.5, and people kind of looked at me crazy. And listen, it didn't come easy. It ended up being a sweat fest. But he ended up pulling it out against the Toronto Raptors. So shout out to Mason Plumlee for coming through. So you're talking about Danger the safety dog. You're talking about some Cole Anthony fantasy points. Let's look at that matchup. Cole Anthony's going up against the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, Anthony, since returning back to the lineup, been struggling. He has been struggling. You want to go here against the Los Angeles Clippers? Well, you might want to think twice. Clippers giving up just 44 fantasy points. It sounds like a lot, but when you look at where they fall in line here, that's the 8th fewest over the last 7 games. Pretty tough against opposing point guards. But this number here of 27.5 fantasy score might be a good one. Might be good enough for Cole Anthony to get it done. Let's just pull up a projection real quick on Anthony, again, who has been struggling over the last 5 games. He's going to break out eventually, right? Listen, I got him projected for 34.1 fantasy points. So Fantasy Labs really liking Cole Anthony here. And he gets a rating of 83.8 going up against this Los Angeles Clippers team. So there you go. Cole Anthony. One of the plays that Danger the safety dog is really liking. And he also mentions Mason Plumlee. Let's take a look at Mason Plumlee while we're digging into some of the picks that you guys are suggesting here. Mason Plumlee, last 2 games, has covered his fantasy score of 20 fantasy points. He's going up against an Indiana Pacers front court who's going to be without Miles Turner, and they're going to be without Domantas Sabonis. So it's going to be Goga Bitadze and Torrey Craig once again. Ooh. But then again, do we trust Mason Plumlee a whole lot? That's what we really have to ask ourselves. Do we want to put our money in on Mason Plumlee? Maybe. Check this out, folks. Indiana giving up over 65 fantasy points per game over the last 7 games. That's the second most. They're one of only 2 teams giving up 65 or more fantasy points per game to the center position. So to say that there's some upside here, I think there's a bit of an understatement there. This guy needs 20.1 fantasy points facing a team giving up over 65 fantasy points per game. There could be some upside here for Mr. Mason Plumlee. Let's go ahead and pull a projection for him. I got him projected for 24.4 fantasy points. That's 4 points fantasy higher than where he's at on Prize Picks at just 20. You might be onto something here. Listen, the rating on this guy, 67.8. Not the highest rating that you want to see, right? Doesn't need a whole lot, though, to get over 20, and he's shown pretty good ability to do so in the last 2 games. Gotta love the matchup. It's all about playing the matchup. So thanks for leaving those picks. Danger, the safety dog. Trenton wants to know, what do we think about Franz Wagner? Franz Wagner. I don't know, man. The Orlando Magic going to be mostly healthy tonight. Sounds like Mo Bamba's going to be in. Wendell Carter Jr. is going to be in. Of course, Cole Anthony, Jalen Suggs. You got Gary Harris in the mix. So where does that leave Franz Wagner? Let's take a look. We've got him up here at 27.5 fantasy points on FanDuel. Last 5 games, not the greatest for Franz Wagner. I mean, he's shown a floor of 12.9 fantasy points and a ceiling of 35.3 fantasy points. So which Wagner will we get tonight? Should be a close competitive game here against the Clippers. Let's pull a matchup here for Franz Wagner. Should be slotted in as the small forward, right? Going up against the Clippers, who are giving up over 42 fantasy points per game, nearly 43 fantasy points per game to opposing small forwards. So I think maybe Franz Wagner could be in play here. Clippers, again, ranking as the team giving up the 8th most fantasy points over the last 7 games to the position. Let's take a look. Franz Wagner got his brother Mo Wagner right below him here, but we're talking Franz Wagner at 28 fantasy points. Looks like a slight favorite to go over at 27.5. But I don't know, man. Don't know that I'm loving it. Could it happen? Yeah, he could definitely go over. He's shown that upside of 28 and 35 fantasy points. But with everybody healthy and back for the Orlando Magic, I just don't know that I want to go there personally. I just don't know that I want to do it. Going back to chat here, let's see what you guys are talking about. Jeff B 1988 says the Denver-Brooklyn game spread is now 2.5 points. Doesn't think it'll blow out, or at least he hopes not. Okay, I can get down with that. He's also talking about some Jakob Poeltl fantasy points. Let's look at Jakob Poeltl's fantasy points. Listen, low-key, Jakob Poeltl's been playing very good basketball lately, folks. I don't know if you guys are paying attention to Jakob Poeltl. Not a household name. Not a household name by any means, but Poeltl playing some good basketball. You look at the last 5 games here for Jakob Poeltl at 36 fantasy points. He's covered in 5 straight, 100% hit rate, and he's averaging nearly 44 fantasy points per game in that 5-game span. Now he's taking on the Memphis Grizzlies tonight. It will be no easy task against Steven Adams. So we'll have to take a look at this matchup real quick. We'll go to the center spot. We'll take a look at FanDuel points, or fantasy points allowed in this case by the Memphis Grizzlies. And they're down here in the middle of the pack, giving up over 54 fantasy points per game. Like smack dab right in the middle of the league. So kind of an average matchup for Jakob Poeltl. Not an overly tough or not an underly difficult matchup, if that makes any sense, but an average matchup. So let's take a look at the projection here for Jakob Poeltl. Got him projected for 35.8 fantasy points. Now we round that up. We call it 36 fantasy points, and they're pretty much right in line here with what we're seeing on Prize Picks. Prize Picks has a pretty sharp number up for Poeltl. But I will say this, he's got 53-point upside in this matchup according to the models here on Fantasy Labs. And his rating is very solid as well, 86.4 out of 100. So I think that there's some real legit upside here for Jakob Poeltl. I don't hate you taking the over here. One thing that we can do to kind of take things a step further, like we've done on some of these other players, we go Jakob Poeltl, FanDuel points versus Memphis logs. And then we could kind of get an idea how many times he's covered 36 fantasy points as a member of the Spurs versus the Memphis Grizzlies. Now, they played the Grizzlies back on December 31st last year, this season, and he ended up with 30.9 fantasy points in 24 minutes of court time. So that's not the most encouraging thing to see, right? Did not cover. Now we look at some games from last season. This was with Jonas Valanciunas with the Memphis Grizzlies, not Steven Adams, had 22.2 fantasy points, 29.2. Listen, he's never in his career gone over 36 fantasy points against the Memphis Grizzlies. So for me, I know the matchup, not overly difficult, as I said before, but he's going to be facing off against Steven Adams. I might have to back off of this one a little bit. Now, one thing that we can do is go Jakob Poeltl FanDuel points versus Steven Adams and see how many times he's actually covered this number against Steven Adams. Well, things get a little bit better, but not great. He's covered his fantasy point prop tonight of 36 one time against Steven Adams in his career, and that was back on April 24th last season. All right? So I might have to take my foot off of the gas on Jakob Poeltl tonight against Steven Adams. Don't know that we have to go there. Maybe there's an easier way to go. All right? Let's see what else you guys are talking about here. We've got Everyday Fantasies talking about some Aaron Gordan fantasy points. For me, Aaron Gordan would be more of a play if Will Barton is out. I would definitely say I feel more comfortable, more confident firing up AG against the Brooklyn Nets without Will Barton. But let's take a look at it. The last 5 games for Aaron Gordan at 26 fantasy points, he's gone over 26 fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games. In that span, averaging over 35 fantasy points per game. So now that we know that, let's take a look at the matchup here against this Brooklyn Nets team. Aaron Gordan, power forward position. Brooklyn Nets giving up, about 40.5 fantasy points per game, which is actually the 7th fewest. So the matchup, not great. Now he needs 26.1 fantasy points, facing a team giving up over 40 fantasy points to the power forward position. So for me, I think there's some upside here. I'm not saying that he can't get it done. He could absolutely get it done. Now, especially if Will Barton's out, then I think some of that usage gets sucked up by Aaron Gordan, and I think he has an even easier time or a better chance of going over his fantasy point prop. Looking at the projections for Aaron Gordan, I got him at 26.8 fantasy points according to the Fantasy Labs models. His rating, though, just 67.6. Not the strongest vote of confidence there. Showing about a 39 fantasy point ceiling in this particular matchup. So not the greatest matchup in the world on paper, but I can kind of see what you're talking about here with Aaron Gordan. Everyday Fantasy is mentioning Chris Middleton's fantasy points. Chris Middleton, Milwaukee Bucks swingman. Of course, the Bucks pretty much full strength now, right? Drew Holiday's back. I don't think Grayson Allen will be in after he broke Alex Caruso's wrist. I think he's serving a suspension. Isn't that why he's out? I'm pretty sure. Anyway, it'll be Giannis, Drew Holiday, and Chris Middleton for the Milwaukee Bucks. Their big 3 should all be healthy and ready to go. So Chris Middleton's been doing a great job at covering his fantasy point prop of 39.5. Let's take a look at this matchup against the Cleveland Cavaliers. Cleveland is a pretty tough team. Defensively, they do a good job. So let's go see how many fantasy points they're giving up to small forwards over the last 7 games. Go all the way down to the bottom here. Cleveland giving up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to the small forward position in the last 7 games. So tough matchup. Tough matchup against the Cavs. Let's just look at the shooting guard spot here. Cavs giving up 36.6 fantasy points, the 6th fewest. So I don't know, man. With everybody back for the Milwaukee Bucks, maybe I'm off of Drew Holiday, or maybe I'm off of Chris Middleton with Drew Holiday and Giannis Antetokounmpo and company being active for Milwaukee. Let's pull a projection up, though. I got Chris Middleton projected for 40.7 fantasy points, putting him as a slight favorite over the 39.5. He's got a rating of 82.8 according to Fantasy Labs. So you could go here. I'm just not seeing a lot of an edge here, much of an edge. Not a terrible play, though. Not a terrible play. Anything else that you guys are liking that you want me to take a look at? Definitely leave it into the chat. Appreciate everybody who is here. Hit the like button while you're here and let me know that you're digging what I'm putting down. Let's take a look and see if there's any other advantageous spots here that we should be looking at. Brooklyn Nets giving up about 43.1 fantasy points per game to shooting guards. I think that helps our previous pick of Monty Morris, especially over his first half fantasy points. That looked very good. We talked about Devin Booker versus Utah. That could be a matchup worth exploring. Let's look at this Milwaukee Bucks team. They're going up against Cleveland. The only Cleveland player that we have up on the board right now is this guy, Darius Garland, who didn't have the greatest game last couple of games against New York. He's more of a point guard, though, right? Sometimes they play Rondo and Garland together in the backcourt. So maybe Garland against Milwaukee could be in play. He's at 37.5 fantasy points. Let's see what his projection is at on Fantasy Labs. They got him at 38.8, an 88.8 rating. So he's rated really high here. And he's got a ceiling of nearly 55 fantasy points in this matchup against the Bucks. So there's some upside here for Darius Garland in this matchup. Now, I kind of want to know how Garland has done against the Milwaukee Bucks in the past. So we can do that, check into that by using StatMuse. Darius Garland, FanDuel points versus Bucks logs. And he has never, ever in his career gone over 37.5 fantasy points against the Milwaukee Bucks. So maybe this isn't the game. This isn't the night for Darius Garland to get back on track. He had 23.1 fantasy points back on December 6th. And then on December 18th, 36.8. Close, but close doesn't cut it in this case. So I'm probably going to have to stay off of Darius Garland, especially if they put the pit bull known as Drew Holiday on him, one of the better defenders at the guard spot. I think I'm off, Mr. Garland. Let's just go through the rest of these here and see if there's anything else that's popping up. Let's go to the small forward spot, see what teams are giving up the most fantasy points there. You got the Orlando Magic giving up 43.7, but who do we like on the other side of that for the Clippers? Marcus Morris is out, and the only Clippers player we have to choose from right now is going to be Reggie Jackson, who is anything but a small forward. So can't really go there, right? Indiana giving up over 45 fantasy points per game. We talked about the Pacers earlier. Maybe that bodes well for somebody like Miles Bridges. He's kind of the power forward, small forward, kind of tough to tell, right, with Miles Bridges. But he's been playing some pretty decent basketball. It's been hit or miss with him, though. Last couple of games, misses. The game before that, 52.8 fantasy points against the Oklahoma City Thunder. I don't think Gordon Hayward's going to play tonight, but I don't know that we have an official ruling on him. Let's take a look at Bridges and his projection. Got him projected for 36.2 fantasy points. So again, pretty sharp number here on Prize Picks. Probably going to be a fade for me. Let's see what other matchups are looking particularly good here. Talked about Sacramento earlier, going up against the Hawks. But we don't really have any of the Hawks wing players. They got Trae Young and they got the two bigs, Clint Capella, John Collins. So we can't really take advantage of that matchup. Brooklyn giving up over 43 fantasy points per game to opposing small forwards. So Brooklyn just bleeding points left and right. Maybe that helps Aaron Gordon's case a little bit. Maybe that would help Will Barton if Will Barton ends up playing. Going to the power forward spot here. Denver giving up over 52 fantasy points per game to opposing power forwards. But the Brooklyn Nets, not going to have really anybody on the board that we can take advantage of that matchup, right? You got Kessler Edwards. Maybe he's in play. Do we want to go Kessler Edwards at 20 fantasy points? Maybe. It's been kind of ugly. I don't know that I love him or trust him. Don't know much about him, to be honest with you. But I could pull a projection for you for anybody who's curious about Kessler Edwards. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel here for this Brooklyn Nets squad. Listen, he's projected for 24.4 fantasy points, which is over 4 points higher than where he's at on Prize Picks. Not a bad rating either for a relatively unknown player. 72.2 Fantasy Labs rating for this kid. Maybe he's in play. Milwaukee giving up over 51 fantasy points per game to opposing power forwards. So who would that directly benefit? Well, Evan Mobley, but he's not up on the board. Jared Allen, we're not sure if he's playing. Kevin Love, maybe. We know Lauri Markkanen's out. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. Same thing with Sacramento, giving up over 48 fantasy points to opposing power forwards. So that would put a guy like John Collins in play. 32 fantasy points for Collins. Has failed to eclipse 30 fantasy points in 2 straight games. But we go back to Minnesota. He had 45 there. 41 against Milwaukee. So maybe John Collins at 32 fantasy points in a pretty mushy-gushy matchup against this Sacramento Kings squad, giving up the 5th most fantasy points over the last 7 games. Maybe we go with JC, John Collins. Let's go ahead and pull a projection up for Mr. Collins, and we'll let you know if that's a good look or a bad look. Got him projected for 32.4. Prize Picks again with a pretty sharp number here. His rating, 76.3, but he does have a ceiling of over 45 fantasy points. Do you guys believe in John Collins, though? I don't know if I do. Hard for me to get on board with John Collins tonight. We talked about liking some Jakob Poeltl. Somebody in the chat mentioned Jakob Poeltl against Memphis. Memphis giving up over 45 fantasy points per game to power forwards. Do we have anybody up on the board for the Spurs side of things where we could take advantage of that? Not really. Maybe it would be Keldon Johnson if he was up on the board, but he's not. So let's go over to the center position. We'll finish things off there. Clippers, the team giving up the 1st most fantasy points per game to opposing centers. So which one of these guys will it be? Will it be Mo Bamba at 28 fantasy points, who takes advantage of this matchup? Or will it be his buddy in the paint, Wendell Carter Jr., a lot more reliable and trustworthy in my opinion? Because I know Wendell Carter Jr., as a Magic fan, is going to have his butt down in the paint, getting rebounds, getting easy buckets. He's not going to be like 7-foot Mo Bamba out there shooting 3-pointers at the 3-point line. So frustrating when guys like Karl Anthony Towns, Julius Randle, Mo Bamba want to be point guards and go drift out to the 3-point line and shoot threes. No, we want you down in the paint, getting rebounds and getting easy buckets, blocking some shots, stuff like that. Stuff that adds up to big fantasy points, right? That's where Wendell Carter really shines. So the Clippers giving up over 67 fantasy points per game over the last 7 games. Maybe Wendell Carter Jr. is the man of the hour tonight. Let's go ahead and take a look at this matchup. This projection for Carter, 32.6. A little bit of upside here with a 46-point fantasy ceiling. And his rating is 76.1. Pretty strong rating here as well for Mr. Wendell Carter Jr. So out of him and Mo Bamba, I'm probably trusting Wendy a little bit more than Mo. But while we're here, let's go ahead, pull projection up for Mo. They got him at 30.5, showing some upside at just 28 fantasy points over on Prize Picks. So maybe you can go him, but I think I like Wendell Carter Jr. more. Looks like a great spot, though, for both guys. We talked about Indiana, no Miles Turner, no Domantas Sabonis. Mason Plumlee was discussed. I know, it's Mason Plumlee. Listen, I know. Mason Plumlee, not the most trustworthy guy. I get it. But we got to talk about him because Indiana's given up the 2nd most fantasy points. All right, so consider a little bit of Mason Plumlee tonight. Maybe we go with Ivica Zubac. He is not up on the Prize Picks board for whatever reason. But if they put him up on the board, Orlando giving up over 63 fantasy points per game to centers. So maybe Ivica Zubac is worth a look tonight. Sacramento Kings, they're allowing over 63 fantasy points per game to centers. That would put Clint Capella in play. I know Clint Capella's been struggling in the last 3 games, and especially in the last 2 games since re-entering the lineup for the Atlanta Hawks. But if there was ever a game for Clint Capella to get right, it would probably be this one against Sacramento, who's giving up the 6th most fantasy points per game to the center position. I got Capella projected for 32 fantasy points, rating of 80.9. So again, Prize Picks, pretty sharp number here on Clint Capella. All right, gang. If you got any other plays, any other picks or questions, let me know. Tyler saying that he loves Poeltl for a sneaky pick. It could be a good play. Not terrible. XX Hustle. XX X is liking some Darius Garland over on assists. We've talked all about fantasy points, which is kind of the point of the show. But yeah, I think Darius Garland's assists could be in play here, especially if you think Drew Holiday puts the clamps on Garland. He's going to have to pass to somebody. If he's not shooting, maybe he's assisting on some buckets. But yeah, you could go Darius Garland's assists. I don't think that that's a terrible look whatsoever. Everyday Fantasy is liking some Ayo Dosunmu fantasy points. Let's take a look at him real quick, because I know he's been balling here lately. He's been balling. With all the injuries to the Bulls backcourt, Lonzo Ball, Alex Caruso, Levine was out for a little bit. Dosunmu has been getting it done. Over the last 5 games, he's covered 23 fantasy points in 3 out of 5, a 60% hit rate. And then you look at his average, 33.5 fantasy points. This Raptors backcourt, not quite sure what's going to happen. Is Fred VanVleet in or out? We don't know just yet. At least I don't know. Maybe you guys know. And we also have to keep an eye out on Scotty Barnes. Is Scotty Barnes in or out? We don't know yet. At least I don't. But Dosunmu, kind of the shooting guard, small forward position. Raptors giving up over 42 fantasy points per game. So this matchup here looking like a pretty good one. 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing shooting guards. Now, maybe you call him a small forward, which could be, fair and true and accurate. If we look at the matchup against Toronto, when it comes to small forwards, they're giving up over 38 fantasy points. We need 23.1 out of this young man. Very doable here. Let's go ahead and pull a projection up for him. I have him projected for 27 fantasy points, which puts him over 23 by about 4 fantasy points for you folks keeping track and keeping score at home. So I think there's a little bit of upside here for Mr. Ayo, I don't know, Dosunmu, however you say his first name. We call him AD. He's the new AD. Forget the old AD, the brow guy. Forget him. Taking a look at the rest of your comments and questions. Everyday Fantasy is also mentioning some Little fantasy points. Yeah, we could look at that. We could definitely look at some Nasir Little. He is at 25 fantasy points. Over the last 5 games, he has covered this prop. Oh, did they just pull him off the board? He vanished. Did they just really pull Nasir Little off the board? He's not there, folks. We talked about him, and then he disappeared. I think Nasir Little has just been yanked off the board. Not finding him. Let's try his last name. Yep. He gone. He gone, y'all. He gone. Nasir Little's gone. We talked about him, and then he disappeared right before our very eyes. Maybe he got ruled out or something. 13, Hattori Hanso 13. You're mentioning the Bulls. You're saying Levine over 4.5 assists, Vooch points, and fantasy points. Well, because we try to keep things on topic here in terms of fantasy points, I will be glad to look at Mr. Nikola Vucevic at 43 fantasy points going up against Toronto tonight. Will it be Precious Achiuwa that slows Nikola Vucevic down? I don't know that he does. Over the last 5 games for Vooch, 43 fantasy points. He's covered in 3 out of 5. A couple of those games barely getting over the hump. 43.9 versus Cleveland. 43.7 versus Milwaukee. 58 versus OKC. Let's look at this matchup here. We'll make this the last pick play of the day. Ooh, Nasir Little is out with a shoulder injury. No. Say it ain't so. Man, we were just talking about him in real time, and then poof, gone from our lives. The Toronto Raptors giving up about 45 fantasy points per game. That is the 4th fewest. But still, 45 more than 43. Maybe there's a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of upside here for Nikola Vucevic. I got him projected for 46 fantasy points, and the rating is through the roof here. 90.5 rating, 46 fantasy points with a ceiling of 60 fantasy points in this matchup. So I don't mind going over on some Nikola Vucevic and taking a shot. Just to recap, though, in case you guys just got here or in case you missed it, my favorite two fantasy point plays. I actually locked in a 2-pick power entry on these 2 plays. And they happen to be from the same game. My man James Harden over 26.5 fantasy points, first half. And Monty Morris over 11 first half fantasy points. I put those 2 together. I powered it for a 3x payout over on Prize Picks. Hopefully you guys join me and we win some money on that entry. Appreciate you guys checking me out. My name is CJ Curry. Once again, you can find me over on YouTube, CJ Curry. I do a Prize Pick show every single morning talking nothing but player props from 11 a.m. Eastern time till about 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. You can also find me over at Twitter at Curry the Creator. Give me a follow, drop a like on this video, and then we'll catch you next Wednesday talking more Prize Picks and player props. Thanks for being here, guys. See you then. Peace.
Harden.